bit of a phenomena that occurred to me, you know, as I was a child. And, you know, as you probably know, and I'm sure you've all got similar experiences, that you sort of, you went through as a child, but you had difficulty articulating. And so, so this phenomena, I guess I'm using your group as a bit of an experiment to try and explain to you what this actually meant to me, because it was a very important part of my, you know, spiritual development. So obviously I haven't got a teacher on my left shoulder, and I've really just used that as a metaphor to describe a kind of an orientation. It's really an orientation that I got in life when I was hospitalized between the age of 14 and 18. And some of you who were at my previous talk heard me talk about that a little bit. So this orientation really involves two parts. One part is really having life, or what happens to me, as my teacher. So there was this sense of that anything that occurred to me or my experience was there for a reason, and I needed to treat it as being precious and work with it. And the other part of it really was, I'll call it an inner voice, but that inner voice was, you know, kind of challengeable, and I might talk about that a bit later. So they were the two aspects of this so-called teacher on my left shoulder. Yeah. Now, the circumstances that brought this kind of orientation about was, as I think I told you in my last talk, I was hospitalised at the age of 14, very formative, with cancer of my leg. And I spent a long time in those days, as you did, in hospital. And, you know, this is where I think I really forged this kind of orientation to life, where, let me see, what can I say, where there were, you know, a whole variety of either catastrophes or painful events, but also really joyful and interesting events. So spending maybe 3 or 4 years as I was in and out of hospital, it kind of forged this view, which at the time I didn't call the teacher on my left shoulder, but now when I look back, that's the best way I can explain it, or the best way I can articulate it. Yeah. So I guess the start of looking at it is that, you know, this really came out of that childlike view of, of not really having a view, of not really having forged opinions or orientations, or even a view of spiritual practice. So, you know, 14 was a good age in a way to kind of, to be introduced to the idea that I might die. So I could see life as a kind of, you're born, you do the best with what you've got, and then you die. So I became quite charged around the you do the best with what you've got bit. And so kind of really saw life as an opportunity. Now, I think in my last talk I mentioned that, you know, with this whole sense of a spiritual practice, I, in my early 20s, spent some time with the Tibetans, who really saw that that gaining a teacher, or that having a relationship with the teacher, was very important. So big emphasis. My first half a dozen Dharma talks were, you know, this is how you find a teacher. When you find a teacher, you really surrender to that teacher. There's big emphasis on that. So I really tried to do that obediently, but it just didn't settle with me. It just didn't kind of feel right in terms of that whole surrender thing. It seemed like that as a child, I started to trust an internal process that I wasn't quite willing to give up. Yeah. Okay, so I went back to what I knew, which was really a process of learning to be astute with my inner world and really learning from my mistakes and moderating my practice and my life according to my experiences. You know, and this was uh, a pretty kind of independent way to look at things at that sort of stage, especially in India with the Tibetans. It was kind of contrary to the dominant view. Some of you'd probably know, yeah. But this sense didn't exclude. So I'll put a big "and" here, because this wasn't a sense of excluding teachers. It wasn't a sense of excluding wise people in my life or people that were inspirational or that could give me ideas and tools. This was both a sense of that I could learn from others, but that I needed to kind of also learn from my own experience. Okay, so now, and as I said, as a child, I couldn't articulate this. I only articulated it later when, I can't even remember, I think one of my teachers might have asked me how I felt about something. And I really struggled to talk about this sense of life being precious and being a kind of a wisdom honing tool. And as I struggled, I said, it's like I've got a teacher on my left shoulder. And it seemed to resonate with people. People all around kind of said, yeah, that sounds good. So I thought, well, I'll use that as my metaphor and roll with it. So, I'd be interested to hear how you, after this talk, how you respond to that idea. Because as I said, it's a work in progress. So I'll just now talk about a few parts of it, maybe 2 or 3 parts of this metaphor or this sense of working with life, and then we can have a discussion about it. Now, the first part is kind of a major part, and that is life as practice. Life is the place where I learn, where my own mistakes, my own misfortunes, my own pains and gains are the place where I can kind of hone my working with the world. And I really see it as a kind of a moderating or a refining process. And on a retreat recently, I kind of presented it as, as a little bit like the ox herding pictures, but, of the ox herder kind of guiding his ox down the path, and the ox wanders one side into the mud and the other side into the rocks, and it's just gently learning that if you go this way, it's too much. If you go that way, it's too painful. And it's almost like action research, that it's a big experiment. And so the shift in emphasis from a lot of the practices I learned in India was from a self-discipline or a kind of a control or emulating or fostering this and getting rid of that, to more of a kind of a curiosity and an experimental approach. So, it was a shift in emphasis. So I'm working with life as opposed to kind of fighting it or controlling it. I'm kind of rolling with the punches here. And as I often used to say, I'm a junior primary teacher, at least I was. I'm retired now. So, I used to say to the kids in my class on the first day, I used to say, in this class, we love mistakes. Mistakes are the places where we learn, So the places where we go wrong or the places that we make a mistake, that's where we learn. And, it's kind of a real sense of life as practice. Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the inner voice around this, you know, which again I carried from childhood when I was in that hospital experience, is really really a kind of sense of what can I learn here, or what's going on, or whoa, that was interesting, or where did that come from, or well, hang on a minute, this isn't so bad, or you know, hang in there. And I actually remember from hospital this sense of, you know what, it's better to cope than it is to not cope. And that kind of sense gave me some resilience to hang in with what was going on in life. Okay, so that's point one, life as a learning tool. And the next one is I've called authenticity, but it's around being internally honest, okay, which is quite a deep practice. You know, I still often kind of kid myself, and you know, and you know, I can again remember in hospital feeling like I would say something, but being very aware of, you know, actually not being as brave as I said, as being more frightened, or not. You know, I was very much aware of that gap between how I was presenting and how I was really feeling. And I think that's a huge part of this teacher on my left shoulder, is to be really honest with myself. Again, not looking at this is the way I am as opposed to this is the way I should be. Those shoulds come in a lot, you know, especially when you're kind of you know, within a spiritual tradition, you know, I should be kinder, or I should be more tolerant, etc. And with this teacher on my left shoulder, it's almost a constant reminder of being honest and saying, well, I'm not, you know, this is the way it really is, not the way it should be. And working with the way it really is, while being aware of my aims at the same time. And the teacher on my left shoulder would often, you know, it would often be articulated, not with a real voice, but a real sense of, hang on a minute, are you sure? You know, or is that a should? You know, what's really happening here? So that teacher on the left shoulder is really kind of bearing witness to me. It's keeping me honest. Yeah. And on that, there's a whole exploration around that honesty and that sense of judgment that I've become interested in. And the interest lies between what I see as a kind of a judgment, or what's a discernment. And there's a big difference there. You know, a judgment is kind of, I think, harsh and inflexible, and kind of there's a lot of ego in there saying, well, you know, that's bad, but I'm good, or this is, you know, so judgment is a very solid, hard, inflexible way of being, whereas discernment is much more open to change. Well, this is the way it is, but it might, you know, be like that, and it doesn't so much come from ego. So again, the teacher on my left shoulder would often, you know, remind me of that, of, you know, how much investment have you got here in being right? Okay, so that was the second one, that honesty aspect. And the third aspect, again, of this so-called teacher on my left shoulder, is that of kindness, of internal kindness to myself. And that's really important. And that whole sense that I had in hospital, of where people were, by the way, very kind to me, and which was unusual, and it was a good model. It helped me to be kinder to myself. So I would start to notice internal voices saying, oh, well, you're doing it wrong, or, well, you're not as good as such and such, or you should be doing it this way, or, you know, this isn't what I plan to do, or, you know, there was a kind of a harsh tone to my inner voice. So that teacher on my left shoulder really helped me to be kinder to myself. And, you know, as a Dharma teacher, I often see people struggle with that. They're left with either a parent or a school teacher or some kind of harshness, you know, and the inner voice that I've often talked about often comes in with me around saying something like, well, that's fair enough. You know, if I'm feeling frightened about something or if I'm feeling angry, that voice will come, well, that's fair enough. You're going through a hard time. Or, well, that's fair enough. This is the 6th time it's happened to you. So for me, that kindness often was manifested with that statement of that's fair enough, or no big surprise. Oh, no big surprise. Of course, your doctor's going to say that. Or, and there are a variety of statements that really help me with my inner kindness. And, you know, things like forgiveness. You know, I'd make a mistake, and again, I'd think, well, that's fair enough. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're just a kid, or you're just a human being. So that facet of the inner, of the teacher on my left shoulder, I think is very important. And I guess I encourage other people to look at that in themselves. Okay, so they're just 3 parts of this this inner teacher, or and then I kind of jotted down a few ideas that we can talk about now, perhaps, around how to foster this yourself. And again, I'll go back to those 2 parts. One is really fostering that idea that whatever happens to you in life is there, you know, for you to learn from. My kids, my children, as in my own children, still often throw back at me, you know, but Mum, you're always saying what doesn't kill you is good for you. So, you know, so I often get it thrown back at me, this whole sense of, well, this is where we learn. And then that inner voice that can often be challenged. Just because your inner voice is saying something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So there isn't a sense of the inner voice as being some kind of, you know, kind of God or some kind of untouchable. It can often be challenged, you know, which I find useful too. So I'll just go to the points that I found useful in fostering this teacher, or acknowledging it. One is a practice that is really based around curiosity and understanding. You know, I want to understand my life as opposed to kind of control it. Okay, so it's a slightly different emphasis to a more being receptive to whatever's happening. So lots of flexibility, having some solidness, but mainly flexibility and experimenting with that solidness. Okay, so that takes me to the next part, experimentation, of really feeling like an explorer with life, you know, exploring the things that are causing trouble and exploring one's response to it. So having there being a real sense of experimenting with this. And that, you know, the teacher on my left shoulder, because it started when I was a kid, that teacher doesn't belong to any tradition. There's no views, or it's just there as a kind of a challenge and a reminder, and not hearing to any kind of doctrinal stance. So that's where the flexibility comes in. Then I've got written down 2 provisional truths, to allow myself to not just say, right, you know, I've discovered a truth here. That anything I've discovered is provisional, because in discovering it, you're somehow changed, and then you go through life differently. And then that in itself changes one's interface with what one finds out. So I call it really maintaining a flexible truth where nothing is true and movable and immovable. So always allowing for change. And again, that little inner voice would come in so are you sure about that? Or wait and see. Or so how do you know? You know, often I'd come up with some discovery, and in would come that teacher on my left shoulder saying, so how do you know that? You know, are you sure about that? Let's just see what happens, that kind of tone. Okay, and the next point is working with others. And as I said at the beginning, this teacher on my shoulder doesn't exclude having other teachers. I've had teachers the whole way through my life. And, you know, some of my friends I consider my teachers. And so this teacher is not exclusive. It's just a teacher that offers stability and discernment and kind of support. Yeah, inner support. So I have many teachers, many spiritual friends that provide things that are important, like inspiration, like seeing something in me that I don't see, you know, like a habit or a blind spot that I'm not aware of. That's where teachers and spiritual friends come in handy. And that sense of having people in my life who kind of care enough about me in order to understand me. So, you know, so I think spiritual friendship and having teachers is very important. And the teacher on my left shoulder doesn't exclude that. And then the last point I've made is really allowing my meditation as a place for this, as a place not just to be calm, but a place to be with what arises. So my meditation, in a way, is a place where I can be with this teacher on my left shoulder. So there's lots of conversations, lots of reflecting back on, lots of recollection. What happened then? What was I doing? What was I driven by? What was I thinking? So for me, mindfulness or sati or a meditation practice anyway does involve a lot of this going over things and seeing what I'm doing and what drives me, because to me that's where wisdom is honed, in this kind of practice. And, you know, when I was a school teacher, I used to meditate after work, or at least before I went to sleep. And I wouldn't think of it as a meditation that where I was going to have any kind of calm or peace, or I would just sit there and allow the day to go over and over. And I'd think, oh, what was I thinking when I said that to that child? And how was my response to this person? And how did I feel? And I would just allow the day. In a way, it's an ethical exercise. I just allow the day and my actions and my thoughts to kind of mull over and to be able to see them for what they are and to learn from them. Yeah. And it's interesting because today I had some lunch with a friend who was, they asked me about, you know, what I was going to talk about. I was the teacher on my left shoulder and blah, blah, blah. And she then told me a story about how she hasn't been able to sleep at night because her husband's son was visited by the police, and the police were looking into something. And she was saying how she just couldn't sleep, how at night she was going over and over what the police were asking of this boy. And whereas her husband was able to sleep, he was able to block it out. And she was saying, oh, Anna, you know, I wish I could just, you know, wish I could sleep. I wish I didn't have to keep going over and over and ruminating on this issue. And I said, well, you know, maybe that's what your mind needs to do to make sense of it. You know, and this is where the kind of kindness comes in. Maybe your ruminating is what you need to do, and your husband needs to kind of block it. But that doesn't mean his way is a better way and your way is not a good way. And I said, this is a great example of where the teacher on my left shoulder would say, well, you know, maybe you need to do this until you can see something clearly. Maybe you need to allow yourself to have a few sleepless nights in order to see things as they are. And I thought, that would be a good example to give to you, where my teacher on my left shoulder is in a way bringing in a kind of a softness and a gentleness and a different way of looking at something that that helps me with my meditation practice. So that's it. And I'm interested to hear if any of you have a inner voice or a teacher on your left shoulder, or what are your responses to this kind of idea?
Okay, so I'll hold this up. Anybody?
I don't know if I talked too long. I was supposed to talk for.
Hi, I'm Duncan.
Hi, Duncan.
My question is, in experiencing difficult or challenging times, a common response is to respond with anxiety and to dissociate from the experience, which makes it difficult to learn from because you're not really there for it.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in how, as a teenager, when that's time of your life where managing emotions is especially difficult, what do you think it was about your experience that allowed you to stay with it and grow from it and help you reach these conclusions? Maybe you weren't able to articulate at the time, but I'm curious about what was it about your experience at that time that allowed you to stay with it?
Yeah, well, good question. And, at some level, I don't know. But again, the whole experience of being in hospital, I was in wards almost all the time. So I watched people and I could see that some people didn't cope, that some people spat the dummy, as it were, or just collapsed. And I guess I saw it as a choice. I know with some people it wasn't a choice, but I saw it as a choice and thought, whoa, I don't want to have to go through what they're going through. And I thought, I think I mentioned that choice of, you either cope or you don't, and not coping, it has painful outcomes. So in my memory, I saw I had a choice. And when I didn't cope, there were some really kind of strong, wise people around me that encouraged me to. So I think that brings in that last point, or the second to last point that I made, where it's really important to make sure you have a good community of wise people. And I think the Buddha mentions that, he's another one of my teachers, often, is that can help. Having people around that can encourage, that can help you to see things clearly, and that could just give you outright love and compassion. And when I didn't have those strong people around me, because I went back to a mother who was kind of mean, really, when I didn't have that strong support from the nursing staff, etc., that's where the teacher on my left shoulder came in. It was like I was able to give myself that kindness and encouragement.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next question from anybody, or statement or observation?
Jan here. I had lots of resonances with all the things, so many of the things that you said.
Oh, good.
In particular, my experience as a young person was to have that kind of personal conversation as an enemy, as something that definitely wasn't my friend, as something that would really, I absolutely wasn't able to see that there was a difference between the witness and the judge, and the judge was just like there with a hammer. And in a funny way, I realised that's been my path to maturity, has been or to wisdom or to any, you know, to any kind of good thing has been to be able to sort of initially to shut that voice up and then to kind of do what you've described, which is to develop this kind of intimate relationship with it. But the question I had is about those spiritual friends. Because it's a really fascinating idea to me about the way that we can talk when we are meditators, that we can bare our souls in a way, or we can bear the deepest things about us, and yet in some way we kind of retain a dignity. But I feel there's more to it than that, and I'm looking to you for the answer. How do you develop spiritual friends? You know, what does that consist of? In terms of, yes.
Well, yeah, and again, you know, it gets back to learning from your mistakes and allowing for the mistakes and seeing the fact that, you know, this isn't easy, that you're going to, you know, I think, and a lot of people will agree with me, that things like betrayal are very painful and very strong kind of negative thing. So, you know, fear of betrayal, especially when it's happened over and over again, is you know, is a powerful kind of guiding force. And again, that learning from your mistakes, that hones your discernment, I think. And you know, I know from our groups where people get together and we have recollective awareness groups. So we have clusters of anything from 7 to 3 people who get together and work together on their inner world in this way. And, you know, often it's like, oh, you know, I don't work well with this person or this person. You know, you can start to see where things fall down. But it's almost like family. I often think, you know, family were kind of sent for us to practice on. You can't choose them. And, you know, you just have to kind of, you know, go with them. And often the same happens with the spirit, with friends, with people in your Dharma group or whatever. You know, you might not have handpicked them and they might have some annoying qualities. But then it gets back to that when looking back, it's those annoying qualities or that kind of grating that you've kind of learnt the most from. And, you know, some of my, you know, who I now call teachers were the people who really gave me trouble, who really annoyed me, and who really kind of what I thought was thwarting my path. But when I look back and I see, actually, you know what, I learned a lot of patience from being there, that person, or I learned something about myself, so, you know, from being with that person. So I think on hindsight, you can see difficult people as being a part of your spiritual kind of friendship routine, if you know what I mean. And, you know, we have to be careful with our expectations. I mean, I do have in my mind my ultimate spiritual friend, and, you know, they kind of don't exist. So we've got to go with the near perfect ones, you know.
I'm going to step in and I think probably ask what's going to be the last question of the evening, or the statement, which is you made a wonderful comment about the difficult situations and the difficult people are there for us to learn from, which of course is a restatement of the Buddha's teachings of dependent origination.
Yes.
You know, whatever arises from something, and then it leads to something. And I oppose that, if you like, or I contrast it, that's a better word, with what we hear so often, which is that phrase, "it was meant to be," which is just so not the same. But that's my comment. It's now sort of 8:45, so thank you. We had a sort of a late start. I'm going to say on behalf of everybody, thank you very much. Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me, and I hope you know, this is kind of kind of whets your appetite for that whole questioning process, and that whole sense of not pushing away other teachers, but of actually trusting your own inner process, and really trusting it and working with it and using it as a teacher on your left shoulder.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We will.
Thank you.
We will. You and I will be talking on Sunday, I believe.
Oh, okay, good.
Apart from that, we'll see you again another time. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.